I just introduced you and our two speakers, so we are just perfectly on time, and I would like now to give you the floor for presenting your book before giving the floor after to our two discussants. So once again, William, thank you for being here today with us to present your last book.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to the GWU community, and a special thanks to my dear friend Giovanna De Maio for helping to arrange that. We've been colleagues at Brookings for the last couple of years, and I very much admire the work that Giovanna's been doing. Well, I began this project thinking, here is this untested, never before elected leader of France. When he got elected, he was only 39 years old, had never been elected to political office before. And he entered the Elysee Palace with these Herculean ambitions. He declared that he was going to revive France, modernize it in a way that had never been done before. He was going to invigorate Europe and strengthen the drive toward a more integrated European community. And lastly, help reshape the world order at a time of resurgent big power rivalry with China on the rise, Russia showing greater belligerence toward its neighbors, and the United States retreating from the international stage. So he was trying to carve out a new role for France and Europe in this new era. So I think we established a good rapport early on. I had met him through some French diplomatic colleagues, and I was struck by his philosophical approach to governing. And also, of course, he was sort of the avatar of a new generation, and it was going to be, so I thought it would be an interesting book project. My publisher thought so too, to see how this this somewhat untested leader could manage this this agenda of ambitious proposals. So I spent a lot of time in Paris over the course of a couple of years, the first half of his presidency, following him closely. And it was a very eventful time, a lot of turbulence, a lot of ups and downs. He started out fast with a number of reform proposals, and he managed to push some of them through in the face of union opposition. And then, of course, he ran into resistance in the streets, which he had not anticipated. Indeed, many French commentators didn't see the Gilets Jaunes, the yellow vest movement, rising up in the provinces. And this became a shock and a test to him. And during the course of the periodic interviews we had, I asked Macron after the protests had started to die down, I said, what was the biggest surprise for you in your 2 years of power? And he said, la haine, the hatred. He said he could never have fathomed why people would disagree in such a violent way. One thing to disagree on policies and advocate something else, but to do so in such a violent way was something that came as a real shock to him. And of course, this led to further conversations about the threat of far extremist populism, populist nationalists, which he became convinced was the biggest threat to Europe. He spoke to on the 100th anniversary of World War I, when he invited quite a number of leaders, including Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, to Paris to mark that event. And he gave a very strong speech against the dangers of nationalism. And of course, this did not sit well with Donald Trump or with Vladimir Putin. Trump, because he'd been pushing the notion of America first, and Putin, who's been making Russian nationalism a new factor in the what he believes is the revival of his country. So Macron from the beginning told me he saw all of these objectives intertwined. He believed that modernizing France was absolutely essential to invigorating Europe and showing that Germany, in particular Chancellor Merkel, that France was serious about reform and that it was ready to assume leadership of the European Union along with Germany. And Macron was inspired in this view by the history of the French-German tandem, going back to Konrad Adenauer and Charles de Gaulle, and right down through Willy Brandt and Georges Pompidou, and then finally Helmut Kohl, and of course Helmut Schmidt and Giscard, and then followed by Helmut Kohl and Francois Mitterrand. And Macron thought this idea of a French-German tandem was the way to drive Europe forward. However, he became extremely frustrated and disappointed by the response that he received from Chancellor Merkel, who, despite all the admiration she has attracted for her 15 years in power, she is not really a visionary leader. She takes one step forward and then surveys the landscape all around her. And I served for 4 years as the Washington Post correspondent in Berlin, and I interviewed her on a number of occasions. And this is her manner. She doesn't really feel that inspired by visionary projects. And unlike Helmut Kohl, as her former finance minister, Wolfgang Schäuble, told me, she does not have a visceral connection to the idea of European unity. She grew up in the East on the other side of the Berlin Wall, and as Schäuble said, she's not emotionally attached to Germany, to the idea of a more united Europe. When I interviewed Chancellor Kohl at his home in Ludwigshafen, this was back in the mid '80s, he took me out to his backyard and pointed in the distance to France and then to the ground in his backyard and said, "I'm convinced that the blood of French and German soldiers are mingled in the ground that I live on, and I will make sure that this will never happen again." His father had died at Verdun, and he believed that the greatest achievement of the European Union was French-German reconciliation, to make war unthinkable between France and Germany. And indeed, I think that is one of the greatest achievements of the European Union, because for 5 centuries, young French people, young German people were either preparing to go to war or were at war with each other. And this, of course, had divided and destroyed Europe, particularly in the wars of the 20th century. So whereas Macron had absorbed those ideas, he was disappointed that Chancellor Merkel did not really share this. And indeed, with the expansion of the European Union, we've seen more economic nationalism set in. And this has been with the 27 countries, now with Britain leaving, the fractures within Europe are a serious impediment to its further development. My previous book was called Fractured Continent, Europe's Crises and the Fate of the West. And this dealt with how the divisions between the debtors and creditors in the North and South, and then, of course, between East and West with the rise of illiberal authoritarian governments in Hungary and Poland, showing that even democracy can be threatened within the European Union. These have become really existential challenges for the European Union. But I think with the onset of the pandemic earlier this year, everything changed, of course, for the whole world, not just Europe. But in Europe's perspective, we saw Chancellor Merkel suddenly realize that the whole European project could fall apart, and this would have dire consequences for Germany and its economy. And as a result, she really reversed her position on the idea of Europe taking on debt in order to alleviate the disparities between the rich and poor in the north and southern sections of Europe, between the debtors and the creditors. And so as a result, Macron was greatly inspired by the hope that he and she would be able to take Europe forward, showing new leadership. We'll see how that plays out. There was an agreement on a 750 billion euro recovery fund. The terms of that still have to be ironed out, but at least there was a show of support for the hard-hit economies of Italy and of Spain by the wealthy creditors in the north, led by Germany. And so the hope is that this will lead to a recovery of the European economy, which is looking like it will shrink by 10% in this year to come. But what I describe in the book, I divided the narrative into three sections. The first section is France, the second section is Europe, and the third section is called the world. I've already described the challenges he faced on the ground with the Gilets Jaunes in France. In Europe, not only the difficulties that he had in convincing Merkel to show more aggressive leadership to lead Europe toward a united role, but also the difficulties he had with coping with populist challenges, not just Marine Le Pen in his own country, but also Matteo Salvini in Italy, and other populist nationalists who, in his view, threatened to tear apart Europe. And then finally, I had several conversations with him about his relationships with other leaders. I have a chapter on his up and down relationship with Donald Trump, his efforts to persuade Vladimir Putin to turn back toward the West in a new show of partnership, and also his conversations with Xi Jinping in China, trying to persuade him that China needs to accept the idea of reciprocity, that whatever it gets from the West in terms of trade concessions, it needs to open up its own economy toward the West if it hopes to have a free and fair partnership with the West. So these were, what I found was that Macron very much drives his foreign policy through his personal relationships. And in the case of Donald Trump, it started out in a positive way. He was called even the Trump whisperer by his European colleagues because of the way in which they seemed to have almost like a father-son rapport in their early meetings. And Macron was invited to the White House for the first state dinner in the Trump administration. But later on, the relationship soured because Macron was unable to persuade President Trump to refrain from pulling out of the Paris climate change accords, from the Iran deal. And as a result, when he saw that Trump was determined to push through with his nationalist vision, he pretty much gave up. And this is what other leaders, such as Angela Merkel, had concluded early on. But Macron felt it was important, at least, to maintain a civil relationship with the leader of the United States, because he still believes, even though he wants Europe to assume greater independence and autonomy for its own security and sovereignty, he believes this can best be achieved by securing collaboration with the United States. And the last chapter of my book, I explore what it's like, what he thinks the world will be like over the next 30 years. And we didn't while the pandemic had not yet erupted on the world scene. I thought it was interesting to say, where do you think you will be 30 years from now when you're 70 years old, looking back? And he said right away, I think the biggest transformation will be the spectacular modernization of Africa. And he has this long-term vision that just as Fernand Braudel, the great French historian, talked about in his books about the Mediterranean, that over time that the European and African populations will come together in such a way that it'll create a new kind of a civilization, which I found to be rather striking. He had asked me what was the biggest change in my professional life, and I said, of course, it was the fall of the Berlin Wall, and maybe later on the rise of China. But in his view, looking ahead 30 years from now, he thinks that the spectacular transformation of Africa could be something that really shakes up the world. But so I think I'll stop here and join the conversation with my colleagues here. And once again, thank you for the opportunity to lay out the narrative of my book.
Well, thank you so much, William, for that great presentation. It is so wonderful to have this kind of first-hand perspective on Macron himself and on other European leaders who are really in a very kind of privileged and unique position to look at him and the other. I now would like to give the floor to our two discussants. First, Hilary, then Giovanna, then I think I will give you the floor back. William, if you want to comment on their own comments, and then we will open the floor for questions. I will ask people to ask their question in the chat box. We are also live on Facebook, so there may be questions coming from Facebook also that I will be moderating. So Hilary, I will give you the floor now.
Merci. A great book. I'm holding it up because the cover is wonderful. It's the wonderful colors of Europe. And I enjoyed reading it very much. It's a very readable book. It's quite engaging. It has a very provocative thesis to it. And I'm sure that all of you are wondering about the significance of its title. And really, we encounter the title only at the very end, where I almost feel as if it ends on a pessimistic note that Europe may indeed, given all of its threats and all of the geopolitical rivals out there, that Europe might actually disintegrate, and that it's because he will be the last president of Europe because Europe may not have much of a future, or at least that was the implication I took away from the title. So perhaps William will say a bit more about why he called the book the way he did. He does lay out what appears to be a consistent geopolitical strategy by Macron. And it's a strategy that France has taken in the past, certainly. France has always intervened in the world, not just in Europe, but through Europe into the world. Its post-colonial foreign policies are indeed interventionist, which may be one reason why Africa seems so attractive, because of continuing military engagement in the Sahel and the engagement of France in Northern Africa. But he also, in this book, it covers the horizon from China, Russia, Iran, the Paris Accords on climate change. And I did enjoy your metaphor of judo in dealing with Donald Trump, that you have to wait for your opportunity to debalance your opponent. I thought that was an interesting metaphor. And we've just seen Macron show up in Beirut recently with the terrible port explosion. So in a funny way, the nationalism of the United States has created a vacuum for Macron and for France, and through him, Europe on the international stage, because this vacuum, you know, is that from the United States is really quite notable in the last few years. And it's given Macron an opportunity to shine and to speak, how shall I say this? The French vision of nationalism, its mission for the world, its universalist vision, as you would put it, right? To be a visionary in foreign affairs. That this is a long tradition in French foreign policy, the bringing of human rights, for example, the attempts to downplay religious warfare through enlightenment and other sorts of values that are portrayed as European-wide, but you know, Napoleon tried to bring enlightenment to Europe too at a certain point. So it's not exactly the first time that we see France bringing its particular vision, universalist vision of European values to the world. So that was one thing I wanted to address. And since I also work on Germany, I do agree with you that Merkel has been relatively reticent to take leadership. And I think that Germany, it's a funny place where the weight of history continues to weigh heavily on foreign policy in Germany. We saw it, for example, during the Balkan Wars, that, you know, when the United States did not want to intervene in the Balkans, Germany did eventually give in and send troops. So it's a little bit like watching Japan come out of the World War II as well. But Germany has a tendency to eschew nationalism. And in spite of the rise of the Alternativen für Deutschland, nevertheless, it doesn't see its role in Europe beyond the market because it's an exporting country, just to say the least. So this leaves a vacuum once again for Macron and France. So one of the things I was hoping to do is, given that you've structured your book the way you have, I wanted to bring up a few things about France, a few things about Europe, in addition to the more international stage that I've just mentioned. And one of the things I wanted to do is riff a bit on some of the challenges that have arisen since your book ended. So one of them was the big coup for France was to get Merkel and the Frugal Four to agree to this recovery plan. And really, he is then really at the inception of what has eluded Europe, namely a fiscal policy, a common fiscal policy, where where countries are actually able to stimulate the economy beyond the 3% GDP limit. And I find that kind of interesting because while the Eurozone imposed on the Southern European states austerity, France has always had this little dance of really jumping over the 3% limit and saying, oh, it should average and so on. It had terrible deficit problems too. And that's one reason why you see this persistent youth unemployment is that you can't get, you know, the French state can't spend its way out of this. You know, it constantly, so it'll run a deficit in the Sécurité Sociale accounts, right, and things like that, which is sort of a hidden way to overrule the European limits on spending. Nevertheless, this new fiscal policy really creates a new opportunity for Macron to put his investment strategy into action, because in addition to taking the money from the recovery fund, he also has unveiled an economic stimulus package for France itself. So he intends now to, he has a plan, right? He wants to bring back planning, as The Economist has recently said, to France and to Europe, where he wants to redirect public investment to green measures like building insulation, hydrogen research, as well as what they call the social investment approach to a social Europe, building skills and apprenticeship and training for the young. So this is another way in which France has had a big influence on Europe. Jacques Delors was perhaps one of the biggest advocates of a social Europe, where trying to bring the European member states together, not simply on market integration or even security policy, but also to have a common vision of what a social Europe might look like. Which brings me to my last point of what has recently been happening. So there have been, during the pandemic, a lot of anti-racist protests in France. So this comes after the defeat of the Gilets Jaunes, which was, as you pointed out, I really much enjoyed your discussion of how the traffic circles in France become public space for demonstrations of the Gilets Jaunes. I thought that was very interesting. But in addition, we have new wave of anti-racism protests that were sparked actually by the United States, by the killing of George Floyd, and recalling the Adama Traore asphyxiation in 2016. And so there was an immediate kind of resonance in between the United States and the Black Lives Matters protests. And in addition, we've just had the trial of the terrorists for the Charlie Hebdo and the kosher supermarket murders. That's also has come to the fore again, reminding domestic politics about issues of Islam. And so Macron on October 2nd gave this big speech about trying to end the ghettoization of the republic and the Islamic separatism that is arising in France, and that it is hostile to the laïcité of the republic and a one and indivisible France, right? And he has this law and order trope that seems at odds with how he talks in Europe. And at home now, he's shifted not to the left in terms of social policy, but he's shifted to the right, taking a law and order page from Trump or Sarkozy, if you prefer, who condemned the ensavagement of France and so on. So security and Islamization and migration are also ways in which he sort of does this balancing act to remain in power between shifting to the left and modernizing France, particularly for the younger generation, through social investment, through training, and so on, and then shifting to the right on some of these issues of Islam and terrorism, law and order, security that has come back. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that political strategy as well, Europe versus France. And I will end there and turn it over to my colleague.
Thank you, Hilary. I think you laid out a lot of points that actually are a good segue for me. Thank you, Marlene, and thank you to GW for having me here. This is my first event as visiting scholar at GW. So I couldn't be more thrilled to start with a discussion on Bill's book. I think it's a very good photograph on Europe and how what kind of Europe Macron inherited. So what are the main political trends that are going to be also perhaps changed with the turning point of coronavirus? So maybe one day you will have a sequel on it. So I would like to make three main points, but the first one is a more domestic issue. The second and the third are more on the international perspective. And I'll try to broaden a little bit following up to Hilary's point. So as an Italian watcher that I've been monitoring populism and nationalist movements and parties in Italy, I was particularly attracted by and interested by the way Macron dealt with those kind of challenges. In particular, like at the beginning when he ran his presidential campaign and maybe a couple of years into his presidency, he was very strong in terms of opposing globalist and progressive forces to nationalist forces of Marine Le Pen. And I think this, over the years, perhaps maybe you can tell me if I'm wrong, he kind of tried to engage more on the substance, trying not to have a dismissive attitude towards nationalism, and from here also kind of trying to engage with Orban as well. But his efforts, I found it interesting that he tried to channel this nationalist energy and anti-establishment sentiment into more official and established channels. What I'm thinking of is, as you mentioned in your book, the Gilets Jaunes protest, the yellow vest. Basically, he came up with the idea of the town halls through which he could listen to people. He would kind of trying to address the feeling of disempowerment, and the distance, and trying to bridge the gap between people and establishment. And I remember attending one of those town halls here in DC at the Embassy of France, and it was very interesting to see like the issues that were raised that were very dear to the people that have either dual nationalities or French expats here. So I think this was quite a successful way to address this. I don't think this was sufficient to address all the claims and to avoid this from repeating in the future. But I do think that it's a different way to address it. In Italy, it became sort of translated into direct democracy, and there was the Five-Star Movement, whose leader actually met with the Gilets Jaunes groups in Paris, and following to this, Macron called back the ambassador from Rome for a couple of days for consultation. So there were some sort of tensions at the beginning. But the Five-Star Movement in Italy tried to push for less representatives in the parliament and more direct ways for citizens to express their participation. Now with coronavirus, though, all these forces that are from both left-wing populism, more nationalist, you mentioned Salvini in your book, they seem to have a hard time. Also, Alternative for Germany doesn't seem to do pretty well because there has been, I think, a widespread rally around the flag effect, just trying to follow the leader and trust in such crazy times of like very also deep and times full of sorrow. But I was looking at the approval rate for Macron, for example. He has like 40%. Marine Le Pen is around 22%. But I was also like looking at those polls. I was looking at also what are these very, very early polls for the presidential elections that are going to be around 2020 in April 2022. And I was looking at instead in those polls, Macron and Le Pen are kind of close. Like Macron is around 26 and Le Pen is 24% of the people who were of the respondents. So of course it's very, very early to say. But I was wondering if you had a take on this, and if you think Macron did a good job in addressing the nationalists, or what are the other cards that he can play vis-a-vis the confrontation with them. And then I get to the second and third point that are more concerning Europe. I remember you saying that while interviewing him, he seemed very skeptical about Europe being able to hold and to sustain itself and resist another shock. And I want to perhaps be the optimistic voice in the panel by saying that, yes, at the beginning of COVID-19 pandemic, it was not a very good time for Europe. European civil protection mechanism didn't start well. There were states like France, Germany, I think Czech Republic as well, who put a ban on the export of protective medical equipment. So this was really dark times. But then, from there, I think Europe was able to push back towards this challenge. And first of all, healthcare was not a competence of the European Union, and yet there was some response on this level, especially with the the Recovery Fund, which was a French idea, but I think it was more a collegial effort with also Spain and Italy really going for it, trying to, like at every meeting, trying to push forward this idea. And also Merkel, yes, I think I agree with you. She might not have a long-term vision like as bold as Macron has. But indeed, I think Germany was the key to break this deal and to go and to convince the frugal countries to actually agree on such an innovative tool. Now, it's again early to say because some details are going to be finalized, and it's up to the countries to see if this cash inflow can be turned into economic recovery and how they will do it. They might fail in doing so. But I think it was more of a collegial effort, and I was wondering what you thought about Macron playing in this, and maybe he has changed his mind after this. Third and last point, I think what I really give credit to Macron is like pushing forward the view on Europe as a power playing in the great power competition arena. I think it's very bold, and it's also a way to kind of encourage a common stance towards a number of issues and dossiers, like China, for example, where I think European member states are also kind of competing between each other to access Chinese market. But yet, things are changing, especially with COVID. Macron, you have a whole chapter about Macron dealing with Trump, with Putin, with Xi. I think he pushes forward his vision and tries to lead Europe, but is probably doing it from like the French way, without a little bit of could do a little bit more in terms of collegiality, in terms of coming up with a position together. And last point, last little thing I want to say is that Macron's ideas are very brave, but also sometimes they do not resonate well in Washington, especially vis-a-vis the strategic autonomy and European defense. So I was wondering what you thought, trying to put it as we're close to the election. If you think that a Biden administration, potential Biden administration would be more keen to hand to Europe some sort of responsibilities in leaving this discourse on strategic autonomy, trying to detach it from the toxic narrative of decoupling with NATO and how Europeans might detach from the US because of their own strategic autonomy. And I'll stop here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Hilary and Giovanna, for your great comment. First, before we open the floor for questions, I would like to give the floor back to William for maybe some comments and just ongoing discussion with our two discussants.
Sure, I'd be happy to address some of the points raised by Hilary and Giovanna. Starting with Hilary's point, what about the title? Well, I called it The Last President of Europe because I became convinced after my conversations with Macron that he was really the only European leader today who was espousing the values and vision of the founding fathers of the European Union. Whether it was Paul-Henri de Spaak or Robert Schuman and even Adenauer, the vision at the time was eventually Europe will become progressively more united, and that every step forward, as Jacques Delors used to use the bicycle metaphor, Europe has to keep moving forward or it will fall off. And he really was actually the French had elected in Macron, they may have not known it at the time, a man who turned out to be the most pro-European president in modern French history. And this, in a way, was sort of the historical tragedy. Just at a time when the French had done this, Germany was turning down the path of economic nationalism. And I think that's not too strong a term. Even Jürgen Habermas, the greatest modern philosopher in Germany, expressed great anxiety about the fact that a new generation of Germans and their leadership were really more interested in protecting their own economic interests rather than sharing and helping the rest of Europe develop into a more integrated community. And I think, as Giovanna pointed out at the end, this had only changed abruptly when Merkel realized that Europe is the key to Germany's prosperity. I think so. Hillary mentioned it's an export-driven economy. 47% of Germany's economy is based on exports, only 11% here in the United States. And so she came to realize that if France and Italy and Spain and others deteriorated economically, that this would harm Germany's interests because it wouldn't be able to export to them, and it would damage their own prosperity. And so this is an argument that others have been making, but she never came around to it until the pandemic. And I think this is, again, the pandemic has blown apart the obsession with austerity and abiding by the 3% rule on deficits. I mean, right now, with Europe looking at a 10% shrinkage of its economy and massive unemployment, they're doing everything they can just to keep people in jobs and to maintain the stability of their economy. And indeed, Macron, as was pointed out, has had to shift in his own approach. When he came into office, he wanted to see the French become much more or much less dependent on the state. France said when he entered, 57% of its economy was based on the control of the state. And this is higher than any other country in Europe. And he said, I want to get that down to the mid-40s. And that's why I wanted to encourage a more entrepreneurial approach. Wanted to have France become a startup nation, defending young people who wanted to start their own businesses and make it easier for them to do so. But with the pandemic and its consequences, Europe, in a way, has benefited from the fact that it has so much of its economy tied up in the state, because the state was able to do more to support the population. In terms of the way in which he has moved back and forth, particularly on issues like immigration, I think it reflects his maverick nature. I think Macron said the main point, the main reason why he got along at the start with Trump was that we were both mavericks who destroyed the traditional political establishment, both right and left. And indeed, in Macron's case, you know, the Socialist Party is now a shell of what it used to be, and so are the Gaullists. And so he was sort of became a radical centrist, and that allows him the freedom. He says ideology doesn't matter anymore. What matters is pragmatic common sense. And so that's why he has, but he's also become shrewd enough of a politician to realize his biggest threat for the next presidential election, 2022, still comes from Marine Le Pen. So he has to somehow diffuse the support that she gets from radical anti-immigrant factions, and so he's been trying to steal voters from the supporters that she's had in the past. In terms of, Giovanna mentioned the strategic autonomy point that he mentioned. We talked about this at some length, in which he said, you know, it's unhealthy for Europe to depend so much on the United States. And he says this is not not something that arose in the Trump era. He said Europe has to realize that the United States is progressively turning away. And President Obama and his famous pivot toward Asia was reflecting that American interests are shifting away from Europe. And here we are 3 generations, 70 years after World War II. It's only natural that the United States looks at China and other threats rather than stays so strongly engaged, and indeed with Europe. And indeed, I think this is a sentiment that is shared by a lot of Americans across the country, and not just among Trump supporters. That people ask themselves why 70 years after the Second World War and 30 years after the end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, why does the United States still have to act as the ultimate guarantor of European security? And so people, I believe, a majority of Americans are convinced that the time has come for Europe to take control of its own security and its own autonomy. And this is the view that Macron, as a sort of an uber pragmatist, says we have to act on this. And Merkel has echoed these words, although it's very difficult, as Hillary pointed out, for historical reasons, for Germany to start arming itself as a stronger military power. But I think Europe will be confronted with this, even in a Biden administration, even though Biden throughout his career has been a convinced transatlanticist. Europeans will be in for a rude awakening, because a Biden presidency will demand that Europe do more for its own security and take responsibility for its own continent more and more. So I think these are challenges that Macron has seen coming on the horizon, and he's tried to wake Europe up. In fact, he uses those terms. We're sleepwalking through the 21st century, and when he gets criticized by other leaders, he says, well, that's fine. If you you don't like my views, come up with another set of ideas. And he's been harping away on this even at the European summits consistently since he gave his famous speech at the Sorbonne, outlining his vision for a much more a United States of Europe. So I think the big challenge that Europe will now face in terms of its own security will be with the United Kingdom leaving the European Union. France is now the only military power left on the continent. Macron again has stepped forward, and he told me in private conversation, I'm willing to share France's nuclear deterrent and extend the deterrent to cover German territory and the territory of our partners, which is a dramatic and radical shift in French strategic thinking. But he's prepared for this. Whether the other European leaders are is still an open question.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Yeah, I wanted to give the floor back to Hillary and Giovanna if they wanted to comment.
I didn't get a chance to ask you about migration, and you mentioned in your book a bit about Turkey and other authoritarians who oppose, authoritarian states like Hungary and Poland that have opposed a role in migration, accepting migrants. And there's this new idea, the European Commission came up with a new pact on migration and asylum. And I was just wondering what you thought Macron would do in light of this attempt to, on the one hand, find a way to get Poland and Hungary to play ball with the European Union in this East-West game, and also, within Europe, that there should be greater circulation and burden sharing for migration because it's needed. I mean, they need the labor. So
Right.
We didn't talk about it.
Absolutely. For demographic reasons, it's the low birth rate over the last few decades. Europe needs an infusion of immigrants to bolster its society and its economy. And I think Macron recognizes this, but he also sees that it is perceived by parts of the French population, but also all around Europe as a threat. And he's tried to convince his population that, no, this can actually enrich the society. And this has been traditionally in the United States, our view, that we are enriched by successive waves of immigrants. But we're more of an immigrant society, whereas Europe has been the source of migrants. It's been difficult for them to adapt to the view now, oh, well, we've got all these foreigners coming in, we're going to have to care for them. Germany has been relatively successful since 2015 in absorbing more than 1 million immigrants from mainly from Syria, but it still, as we saw with the rise of the AfD, it still is resented by a large part of the population, and threat is exploited by far-right political forces. So this issue is not going to go away. Authoritarian leaders like Orban and the Law and Justice Party in Poland are adamant about what they see as a dilution of their Christian heritage. And you, Hillary, you alluded to Macron's speech. I know he'd been working on this for quite some time, which he talked about, is the threat posed by Islamic separatism. France has the largest Muslim population in Europe, and this is an issue that didn't come up during the Gilets Jaunes, but there's a disaffected young population, a third generation of migrants from North Africa and elsewhere. And that this is still a powder keg in terms of French society that Macron, as well as all of his predecessors, have never found a solution for.
Yeah. Well, now this idea is to get Orban, the states that don't want to take migrants, that they should pay to repatriate the ones that they don't want.
Well, the other stick will be then if they're not going to abide by the laws or the rules of the European Union, then they should not be getting all of these subsidies. Both Poland gets 2 billion euros a month. And yet has been flouting the European rules consistently. And Macron has been leading the cry for saying, look, if they're not going to abide by the rules, then we should cut them off. But if the European Union abides by the rule of unanimity, and of course Poland and Hungary will immediately reject that. So something has to change in the way they perhaps with qualified majority voting, that this could alleviate these blockages.
Yeah.
Do
you wanted, please, to add something, and then after I will open the floor for questions. Yes, go on.
Sounds good. Following up on migration, and having watched the migration trends from the Italian perspective, I think the issue of burden sharing is going to be crucial. At the same time, what I'm seeing is a stronger activism, I would say, from France and Italy, but also on the European level. I think on Borrell's and on High Representative for European Foreign Policy and his advisor on trying to strengthen European hard power. And I've seen Italy and France really cooperating on the UN Irini mission in Libya to prevent, to enforce the arms embargo. So I think a part of it, yes, we have the burden sharing, but we have to kind of address the cause of migration fluxes, and especially in stabilizing Libya, which is the territory from where migration flows, not just from Libya, but also from the Sahel region. So I think that's, yes, okay, the burden sharing, but also I think there is some movement and more awareness on the hard power perspective, especially looking at how the United States has been and will be disengaging from this area. And I think that would be fundamental for Europe to step up, and also in terms of social stability, because migration is also triggering social conflicts between people, a marginalized community that see immigrants as competitors for their job, as has been most frequently repeated here in the United States as well. And I'll stop here.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, all of you, for this great discussion. There are some questions coming in the chat, so I would like to ask them. One is about comparing the civic engagement of En Marche, so Macron's party, before the election, and how it got transformed into Le Grand Débat after the Yellow Vest movement, and more broadly, how, William, would you assess this kind of direct democracy effort that we see in France and in Italy, right? How, because the Macron government is very often accused of not being open enough, not being kind of having this, what they call Jupiterian definition of power, while at the same time they are trying to push for a more, we see that the society is pushing for kind of more direct democracy. So how would you judge this kind of evolution of the party itself around Macron, and of the way Macron has been governing, and the difficulties in creating this kind of more direct democracy mechanisms?
Yes, well, I mean, creating a brand new party from scratch and calling it a movement, which he has done consistently, it's difficult to sustain the enthusiasm and support that he has from the 250,000 people who really form the core of his party. And we've seen that some over time, it's not unexpected that there have been people disgruntled with the drift of the party or the choices. Some of them were more ecologically minded. Others wanted different policies, and they've sort of drifted away from the movement. But Macron, I think, is realizing that he has to personally get involved. And you mentioned the Jupiterian approach. He tried to act as above the fray, which is what some French presidents have done in the past. I interviewed for the book, purpose of the book, Hubert Védrine, who had been chief of staff and later foreign minister under François Mitterrand. And he said whenever Mitterrand was under attack in public or from the press, he would disappear for 5 days. And staff would say, "Oh, well, he's off thinking big thoughts about the future of the world." And of course, this portrayed him as sort of the philosopher king. And Macron told Védrine, as he related to me, he said, "If I tried to do that, people would say I've got a terminal illness, because this is the era of social media. You've got to be live 7 days a week, 24 hours a day if you're president." So reluctantly, he has become, and this is in a way his nature, a micromanager, even to the point of taking responsibility for things as prime minister should do, because in the past, a prime minister was sort of the shield against criticism of the president. But that has not been Macron's case. He has been involved from the start. Now, you mentioned the Gilets Jaunes. At one point, he was so shocked by the attacks that he personally suffered when he went to visit Puy-en-Velin, that people were shouting, that you should be hung up by a guillotine or had your head chopped off. And he came back to the Élysée and was so shocked. He isolated himself for about 3 weeks. I think it was a form of depression. And that was when he rethought how does he get out of this mess? And that's when he came up with the idea of the grand débat, the great convocation and going around and basically subjected himself to humiliating abuse from the population. He would stand up there for 7 hours at some of these town hall meetings, and people would just unload on him. But it was a way for him to get around the country. And in the end, I think it generated some admiration by the fact that he was actually going out there and listening to people. Now, I'm not so sure that they feel satisfied that this has helped in terms of his putting this into a policy, because so many different factions of the population can never be satisfied. But I think that this is what changed the nature of governing France as president from being a Jupiterian figure like Mitterrand liked to be, and Macron would have liked to be, because he does have a philosophical disposition. And he realized you just got to get involved in the day-to-day micromanagement of government.
Giovanna?
If I may on this, because I've been working on and I finished a month ago a paper on democracy after coronavirus that I co-authored with my French colleague at Brookings, Cecilia Benin. And we talked about 5 challenges that democracies are facing right now. And it's interesting that the direct democracy issue is a part of it, especially with COVID. We've seen a lot of restrictions in terms of freedom, restrictions, and having experts taking the lead in some ways, and politicians relying on experts for making a decision. And this, can you not hear me? Is it okay? So this was, I think, a very important challenge that the populist movement have bring up, and Italy has just voted following the multiple claims for direct democracy on a referendum, basically cutting the number of parliamentary representatives, so between the chamber and the Senate. So I think this is a crucial challenge for, as COVID poses a crucial challenge for democracy, but also I think Macron tried to channel into a more structured way, versus more populist movement tried to be more disruptive, presenting parliament and representation as a cost that needed to be cut, but also on the other end, trying to encourage online participation to decision-making, lawmaking, actually, in the life of the party. So I think as COVID has also shown us how good we can be on Zoom and online, it can also be used more as a political tool, but on a positive way, trying to reach citizen engagement and bridge the gap with the establishment and help with decision making.
Yeah, if I could just add to what Giovanna said, I think it's interesting to see that France is now suffering through a big second wave of COVID. On Saturday, I think they had close to 30,000 new cases. And this is going to create, if Macron is trying to avoid another lockdown, because this was very frustrating and difficult for French to go through. Ironically, Italy, which was first afflicted by COVID, is also has not had such a serious second wave. If I'm correct, you can correct me, Giovanna. But it's interesting that the Italian government under Prime Minister Conte seems to be getting high marks for leading the country out of the terrible number of deaths that they had early on to a state where they have not been as badly hurt by a second wave as France and even Germany, which is getting a lot more new cases as seen. So we'll see. I think it's important because this is going to be an important driver of the popular sentiment toward leadership in the months.
Yeah, I think if I can add, I think that would be one of the big problems for the government now, which is that if you look at surveys, the level of trust by the public opinion on the way the government is managing the second wave is really very bad. It's really very low. There are a lot of kind of different dissociated voices. It seems unclear. The government is really criticized for like being late in making some choices, being unable to secure, testing at the higher level and so on. So it will be very difficult. And linked to that, we have a question asking you to comment on exactly like in a sense, the gap between Macron's ambition for Europe and the way he has been able to relaunch voices for France in Europe toward the Middle East. We saw it with his trip to Beirut, and this kind of failure at home, first on the yellow vest, now in the management of the second wave. I mean, it's always easy to criticize, of course, and to say it's a failure. But let's say for the public opinion, the domestic policy looks really mostly kind of negative. At the same time, Macron had this image abroad. So how do you think the gap is manageable for his own legacy and for the fact that he probably will be running for a second round?
Right. Well, I think with his new prime minister, Jean Castex, he wants to delegate more authority for domestic affairs to Castex, and so he can concentrate on foreign policy and defense security policy, which are the natural the purview of the French president traditionally. So that's why he's very active still very active on the international scene. Very concerned again how Europe will manage the recovery fund. Him play a very active role this week at the European Council summit. He met with the leader of the dissident movement of Belarus when he went to Helsinki. He's gone twice now to Lebanon, trying to help find a more stable government there, and he's again trying to find a way to establish a productive and positive relationship with Russia in the wake of the poisoning of Alexei Navalny. So all of these issues are very much on Macron's mind. He's got a very active staff at the Élysée in terms of foreign policy and defense policy. And his political advisors have told him, it's time for you to delegate more authority to your new prime minister, because they saw the way in which his authority was badly damaged during the Gilets Jaunes crisis, because he didn't use his prime minister enough as a shield from criticism. And it'll be interesting to see how he plays this out over the next year and a half ahead of the 2022 presidential elections, because a lot of a lot of people in France, voters in France, will be looking for more stronger leadership from President Macron, and he'll be attacked by Marine Le Pen, of course, on the score.
Yes, thank you so much. We have another question asking you to assess the possibility of the EU for implementing more selective immigration policies like the one we have in the US or in Canada. So kind of having a kind of selective process for migrants, mostly based on their professional skills. How do you assess that possibility of being discussed at the EU level? It's not part of the French tradition, but that could be something that would be discussed in the future.
Right. Well, I think the big vulnerability for European Union is the vast external border that it has to patrol. Even they boosted the number of border guards at Frontex, I guess, to 10,000 or so, but it's still not sufficient, as we see migrants coming across the Mediterranean into Sicily, from Libya, still coming across from Turkey into Greece, and now going into Spain, even the Canary Islands, from Morocco and North Africa. And so far, Europe has just not come up with a good idea on how to, one, protect its borders, have an orderly process of immigration that is agreed upon by all of the countries, so that they could resettle immigrants in different parts of Europe. And Macron fears, in one of the conversations, we said, this is going to be even more of a nightmare in the future. Imagine because it comes intertwined with the threats of climate change and drought, with increasing drought in the Sahara, in Africa. And these people, for example, he mentioned Chad. 5 million people live off of Lake Chad. Lake Chad is drying up. So those people are going to have to pack up and go. And when they want to go, they're not going to go. They want to go to Europe because everybody has a cell phone. They can see life is better in Europe than it is in the neighboring countries of Chad. So this is going to be duplicated on more and more of throughout Africa and the Middle East. And even Germany, Chancellor Merkel has recognized that. She made 3 trips to Africa last year, trying to see how they can generate a Marshall Plan that would create greater economic prosperity at home for these African countries, so that young people will be less inclined to migrate toward Europe. But this is a long-term challenge over 20 years. At least that Europe is going to face. So we're only at the beginning of this problem, not the end.
Very good. And yeah, Hilary, do you want to add something?
Yes, sorry. And I guess I didn't unmute before. I apologize. I was going to say that there are a couple of additional things. So, there was just this terrible fire on the island of Lesbos. And with the COVID pandemic, the external borders have been closed. And so there's this kind of backlog of asylum seekers who are getting really, really desperate. I think in Lesbos, they were from Afghanistan. And I think, you mentioned Africa, but in addition, it's, of course, these endless wars in the Middle East that are also contributing to migration. So Macron's visit to Beirut has implications for Syria as well. And who knows what Russia's role will be in trying to get that finished, because America doesn't seem to care very much for it. It seems to be withdrawing from the Middle East, and that will lead, if the misery continues, that will also lead to a stream of migrants. But I would just also add that the one reason why this new migration pact is so important is also that the frontline states that are precisely receiving these undocumented migrants are the ones that are most fiscally strapped. And so, to rebuild an entire refugee camp for 10,000 people in Greece, when it's also under conditions of austerity and plus the pandemic and so on, it really does require some redistribution and greater solidarity or cohesion funds or whatever for the frontline states. That's true in Italy as well. And even in Spain, where you are getting some movement from Morocco. So, I think that the inability or unwillingness, if you will, of certain states within the European Union to accept responsibility to do more burden sharing in this respect is also contributing to the problem.
Yeah. And if I may, we still have 5 minutes, and there was a question for William. So you mentioned at the end of your presentation, Macron's vision for Africa in 30 years that I found really fascinating, because that's really the kind of Fernand Braudel tradition of thinking that the two sides of the Mediterranean are in fact only one world, right? That they have to work together and live together, that otherwise if one is destroyed, the other side of the Mediterranean is also dysfunctional. But we had a question about Macron's relationship to Russia, which is, of course, something very sensitive for the US policy. a community, because he has been trying to kind of reopen some channel of discussion with Russia, saying that we should recognize Russia's kind of great powers ambition, and we should find a way to both discuss and be critical at the same time, which I think is part, in fact, of his kind of Gaullist tradition of like, we are, as a big nation, we should also respect other big nation and their own ambitions. But so the question is, how do you think this kind of policy toward Russia can make sense? Not only, I mean, of course, for the US it's difficult, but even inside Europe, it's something that is also not consensual. So do you think Macron has any chance to kind of succeed in this Russia policy?
Well, I think that, yeah, this is a key central question facing his presidency, and he gets a lot of criticism from his European peers about continuing to reach out to Russia, and particularly from the Baltic states and from Eastern Europe, who are very suspicious about Russia's designs. But Macron, as an uber realist, says all of these problems, whether it's migration from Syria or problems in the Mediterranean or in Eastern Europe, Europe will never be secure until it finds a more stable security partnership with Russia in the long term. And he says, and I know, I'm aware of how evil Vladimir Putin may be. I'm aware of the poisoning of his dissidents, and the Skripal poisoning, the Litvinenko, and now Navalny. And he says, but I really believe that long term we cannot turn our backs completely on Putin and Russia, because it'll only drive Russia into the arms of China. And that's been happening more and more, that they're now doing joint military exercises. And he thinks that throughout its history, Russia has always had this ambivalent attitude, going back to Peter the Great, who wanted to be a westernizer, a reformer of Russia, and others who have turned back toward Asia. And he says it's in Europe's interest to try and overcome these difficulties with Russia to keep them part of the West. And he believed, in one of I said, look at what Putin has done. How can you think this could be a reliable partner? He said that Putin c'est un fils de Saint Petersburg, meaning he's from a Western-oriented city. And I said, il est plutôt un fils de KGB. And, this is, he says, well, we can disagree on this, but I think this is a matter of opinion. He still believes, and he says, and this is a 20 to 30 year project, that this is going to be outdate. Putin will have passed from the scene, but Europe cannot turn its back on Russia. So he says we need to have a long-term rethinking of our relationship with Russia. And I think other leaders agree with him that this is, in the long term, this is necessary. They just don't want to have to deal with Putin right now.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, there was other question, but it's already 12:30, so we will have, unfortunately, to stop here. But I wanted to thank you really both for being here with us today and for the great book. I really advise everybody to read it, to look at what is happening in France and globally, how Europe is, or Macron himself is trying to rethink Europe and all the challenges that the region now. So once again, William, thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you, Giovanna and Hilary, for also sharing your thoughts and helping us organizing this event. And the event, so as I said, was live on Facebook and will be on our YouTube channel for those of you who want to look at it and listen to it once again. So thank you so much, and please stay in tune with the Iris. We will have other event on France in a few days. Thank you so much, all of you.
Great pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.